don't think anybody's gains are going to be unlocked by more protein. The thing that drives anabolism in muscle is lifting weights.
Dr. Stuart Phillips is a world-leading muscle scientist whose groundbreaking research on protein, strength, and aging is changing the way we train for lifelong health.
There is a notional concept that men and women respond differently to exercise, and the protein is necessary pre-exercise for women. We have data that shows that's not true. Health benefits come from lifting weights in a variety of repetition ranges. There actually is no one specific health benefit that comes with lifting heavy weights that doesn't come with lifting lighter weight close to fatigue.
That phase of menopause for women is tricky, and building muscle in that phase is very hard as well.
We've got data. Women postmenopausally can build muscle. It's not impossible. But when you look at hormone replacement therapy, HT, as a rescuer of muscle, it doesn't work. If men went through that same physiology, there would be an international global commission to figure it out.
All right, Stuart, this is you're a repeat offender here on the podcast.
I am. Yeah.
And rightfully so, because you're in a space where science is ever evolving. It's changing, right? Thankfully, you're not directly in the nutrition space, but you are.
No.
But you are in the space of exercise physiology. I think you're the foremost expert on building muscle, which seems to be so hard for some people. And now look, the majority of listeners on here are female, whether they're perimenopausal, postmenopausal, going through menopause. It seems to be a tricky science to it. And look, I'm the first one to put my hand up and say that it's even difficult for me to lift heavy. The reason why I brought you on here today, because I heard an alarming statistic from a guest, Dr. Christopher Gardner, a couple of weeks ago. We were talking on the podcast, and he said, "Oh, by the way, Louisa, did you know that building muscle is around 10% nutrition and around 90% exercise?" And I said, "Wait, what?" I said, "What?"
Yeah.
He goes, "Yeah, no." Yeah. He goes, "You've got to take this up with Stu." So let's start off by really just unpacking that statement there.
So I think in fairness, and you and I were chatting about it. First, Christopher is a friend, colleague. We were at a meeting in Chicago, and it was all about protein. It was a fantastic meeting organized by Dr. David Allison from the Indiana University School of Medicine. And it really was, a convening of, if it was Christopher, it was Don Lehman, it was myself, it was Luke Van Loon. It was a lot of protein folks. Yeah, it was fantastic. But I ran into Christopher in the gym because I'm there early in the morning, and so is he. So he practices a little of what I preach, and I guess I practice some of what he preaches too, in terms of the vegetarian, vegan, and it's a much bigger part of my protein intake than it ever was. Not quite as extreme as Christopher, I'll just say that flat out. And I think Christopher's big thing is that people are over obsessing about protein, and we can agree to disagree on a few things about that. But ask me this question 20 years ago, and I probably would have given you a different, I don't know, I definitely would have given you a different answer. I'd have been like, oh yeah, no, protein, very important, really, critical, et cetera, et cetera. And then you do your own work in this. And so we published two, I think, of the better meta-analyses out there looking at protein supplementation and its effect on muscle growth. And each of them comes back with a very small amount of added extra muscle gained in the range that it's actually buried within the error of the machine that measures. And the machine doesn't even measure muscle, it measures lean mass, and that's a dual energy X-ray absorptiometer. So it's ostensibly the best machine you have. And the gains are in the range of sort of like 100 to 300 grams of muscle. So not even a pound of extra muscle. And when you look at that as a ratio of what the control groups gain, it's an added, it might not be as little as 10%, but it's definitely around, somewhere around 20% and downwards from there. So And these two meta-analyses were required. In the first case, it was an earlier one, 1,800. In the second case, it was 2,300 individuals to see this effect. And so, the point I make to people is when you see something statistically significant, but you need close to 2,000 individuals, if you mean the two analyses, to see the effect, it's a small effect. So, and we've run as many protein supplementation trials, I think, as the next person. And it's just not big, and that hurts me to say for somebody who's worked as, muscle is the tissue we study, but protein is a key macro, obviously, in that. And, but science, you can't ignore your own science. You can ignore other people's at your own peril. But when you do your own science and that's the answer you get, how can you continue to like protein is still important?
There's only two. Sorry to interrupt you, but there's only two main methods of stimulating muscle protein synthesis, right? It is through protein. It is through exercise, right?
Right.
But what you're arguing is we used to think 20 years ago that protein was the most important thing. Mainly like if you exercise a lot and you're lifting heavy, if you're not having protein, then you probably won't get any gains. Is that correct? Like 20 years ago? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's still a pervasive idea today. At least, and you're more prolific on social media than I am, but scrolling through a feed, it doesn't matter whatever platform you're on. People talk about how, protein this is the missing thing. This is and a lot of times it's not protein, but a lot of times it is protein as the answer as to why you're not seeing the gains that you should be. And I don't think that that's true.
Really? So, okay, I love that you said that, right? Because here I am beating myself like every morning. I'm like, got to get my 50 grams protein for breakfast. And the only way for me to I'm not really hungry first thing in the morning, but I know how important it is for women to eat first thing in the morning and to lower cortisol and just get the circadian rhythm going. This is what I learned from Dr. Stacey Sims, who was on the podcast as well not too long ago. And so if I'm trying to bank on my protein, let's just say I'm trying to have 1.8 grams per milligram of per kilogram of body weight. I'm currently 65 kilos. It's like, okay, let's just say 100 grams a day or a bit more. Like it seems hard for me. So for me to get the 50 grams or even 40 grams per meal, I have to supplement with protein powder. It's very high quality, grass-fed, whey protein. But you're saying that maybe I don't really need to be doing that.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack, and I don't want to oversimplify the message and sort of undersell what some of the things that you're doing, which I think are right. I'll respectfully disagree with Dr. Sims about the absolute necessity for protein first thing in the morning to lower cortisol. I don't think that's a big deal. I think the driver of protein breakdown being cortisol is way oversold as a concept. It comes from textbook style learning where cortisol is the hormone that results in breakdown, and people on glucocorticoid drugs, for example, get muscle wasting and everything. But in normal, healthy people who don't have disrupted sleep and all kinds of things, that's not an issue. So I'll be 100% clear on the fact that I disagree on that. We have some data that we generated several years ago where we compared the response, and I know Dr. Sims has sort of got this out there as a notional concept, that men and women respond differently to exercise and that protein is necessary pre-exercise for women. And we have data that shows that that's not true. So it doesn't make any difference. Like women, just like men, are receptive to protein just after exercise. They don't need to get it on board. But I'll say this. The most important meal, and this is Don Lehman's concept that I think, and he's right on this, that patterns a lot of what happens in the day is the first meal that you eat after you've woken up. So you break your fast. If that's at 0600, good on you. If you're one of my sons, it's at 12 o'clock, but yeah, I know. Remember those days? Um, so, and it's important that that meal contain protein because that's the longest that your body's been without amino acids and protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So I think that that's true. The size of the meal, I'm beginning to think is important, but the requirements that are up around 1.8, I think that the impact of protein really levels off, and like I'm, probably completely flattens off at an intake of about 1.6 grams per kilo. And I
Oh,
think it's
wow.
much more important, like much more important to focus on your total daily protein intake than to focus on, when we thought this too, is like the even distribution throughout the day. And I'm beginning to think that that's a bit of a moot concept. I still do think breakfast is important. And if you're consuming a little dose of protein, that's probably not a good idea. So maybe up that, but that it has to be sort of an even 50-50-50, or, you can overcome anabolic resistance, which is what happens with aging, by eating more. Um, that's not true. The huge, and to give everybody who's listening perspective, the 80% driver, the 90% driver, the thing that bakes the cake, et cetera, and drives anabolism in muscle is lifting weights. And protein is that thin layer of icing, or the sprinkles on the icing, or the cream on the sprinkle, or the cherry, whatever you want to call it. It's essentially a finishing effect. It's not what drives it. And I don't think anybody's gains are going to be unlocked by more protein, unless they're consuming like the RDA or something, right?
So, what if you are going, let's just say you're going hard out at the gym, you're achieving, you're maxing out, like you're doing the correct exercise regimen for muscle building. And what if you're only consuming 70 grams of protein per day? Would you still see the effects?
Yeah, and so this is maybe where Christopher and I might sort of disagree. So I think Christopher sort of slides back, close to the RDA, and he's okay with that, and I think that that's incorrect. So the RDA sits at zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram. To do the translation for pounds is about zero point 0.4 grams per pound. Whereas I think that it's probably closer to, it should be about at least 1.2 or at about 0.6 grams per pound. And it probably tops out at around zero point 0.7 grams per pound or 1.6 grams per kilo. So if you're sliding down to the bottom end of that and you're adhering to that RDA level of requirement, I think you might be getting less back than you could when you're lifting than if you are closer to the top end of what I'm talking about. And, to be clear, there are lots of other people that would advocate for intakes that are higher than what I'm talking about. I just think that the evidence that that's having an effect is, slim to none, let's say.
All right, so then let's move on to actual exercise and stimulus. And I want to bring up the paper that you sent me via email. But before we do, why don't we talk about why it's so goddamn difficult to build muscle? So if we're all doing it wrong, and I'm going to talk about Stacey one more time because she said something that shocked me on the podcast together. She said, "Louisa, I want you doing 3 reps." And I said, what? I said, because I'm doing around 6 reps, right? Because at 6, I'm almost, I've probably got like 2 reps in range after that, in the bank or whatever you call it. So she said, "No, why don't you lift even heavier and max out at 3 reps?" I said, for me to do that, I can't do it on my own because it means I was just thinking about a shoulder press, right? I can't even I would probably lift 45s because I'm doing 30s. I need someone to spot me for that. Unfortunately, right now I don't have anyone who can do that. So I'm like, I can't be doing 3 reps. I've got to, so am I not getting my marginal gains because I'm lifting too many? Is that too high of a rep range that I'm doing?
Yeah, no. I can't say it any simpler, but there probably is, and I don't want to over exaggerate, but if you go and look at the work of Brad Schoenfeld, who's a friend, we've collaborated on a few papers, but he's probably done the best job, I think, out there. And I've had the privilege of authoring a couple of papers with him on looking at the effect of repetition, the whole strength and endurance continuum. So lift in this sweet range for hypertrophy, lift down here, build strength, lift up here, build endurance. And that whole concept is completely blown up. In other words, you can get hypertrophy from as low as 3 if you want to lift that way to as high as 25 repetitions. And it's no different as long as you get close to fatigue. You said you do 6 and there's 2 repetitions in reserve, right? You got
Repetitions in
2 more
reserve.
with
Yes.
yes. All
Yes.
right. Yeah. I know you knew exactly what you meant there. No problem. And so the concept is that when you drive a muscle to the point of fatigue or failure, neural drive is flowing out from your brain and recruiting motor units and then muscle fibers in your muscle. It doesn't matter what you're lifting. And your muscle doesn't know whether you're lifting a kettlebell, a guided motion machine, or you're pressing a bar above your head. Your brain is like, okay, signals to the muscle, generate and activate enough muscle fibers to overcome the load so that I can lift it and lower it. Now, the closer you get down to that 1, 2, 3 repetition range, that's true. It's a misnomer. People call it powerlifting, but powers by definition is faster. But so it's heavyweight, but it's the how much can you bench, how much can you squat, and how much can you deadlift. Overhead press, not part of the powerlifters regime, but I get it. The closer you get down to there, what you're developing is strength. And you're developing it not because your muscles get bigger, but because your brain and your coordination gets good at the task that you train at. And coaches call that the principle of specificity. So if you want to get better at lifting heavy things, then you lift heavy things. If you want to get stronger in general, there's a really wide palette of repetition ranges that you can go through. You might not get as strong, but you don't get as strong because you don't practice lifting strong. In other words, if 1RM lifts and you're the power lifter, you don't do light weights, you do heavy weights because that's your event. But the perfect illustration of what coaches have understood for years is the NFL Combine. Has some very prescribed activities. There's a 40-yard dash. There's 225 on the bar for repetitions to failure. So what do you think the guys who do that train? Well, they train those events.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, of course.
It's sort of like,
it makes sense.
If you want to get better at tennis, then you don't play basketball. And that's exactly what, people who talk about greater strength gains with heavier weights, I get it. If that's your thing and you want to do it, like I'm like this, I'm like 2 thumbs up. But I want everybody who's listening to remember this. 70% of women, and this is from self-reported data, so I think it's probably actually higher, do not lift weights at all. None. So, we can both agree we're drinking the Kool-Aid. Like, it's super important. You got to do it. And my point is, not everybody wants to lift heavy. So the entry into lifting weights is you can lift a lot of things and you can get lots of benefits. So let's not tell people they need to lift heavy because that's just not true. And so I'll say it even simpler. Health benefits come from lifting weights in a variety of repetition ranges. There actually is no one specific health benefit that comes with lifting heavy weights that doesn't come with lifting lighter weights close to fatigue. Now, 60 repetitions, that's not weightlifting anymore. 100 repetitions, that's revolutions on a bike, right? So there is a point at which weights become ineffective. No amount of lifting this pen is ever going to make me stronger. But I push back against people who talk about not lifting the pink dumbbells. It's like a shaming of people. You're doing it wrong. And I get it that there is a threshold. But for a lot of people, that's all they want to do. It's all they can do.
And it's better than nothing.
So, it's a whole, and I mean, there's a principle in exercise physiology that shows when you take people from doing nothing to something, that's where you get the sharpest reduction in risk for every known chronic disease. It happens with endurance, HIIT, lifting doesn't matter. And so why don't we focus a little bit on that and live and let live a little bit around whether people want to lift heavy? Because if you want to, I'm not going to tell you not to. But, and forgive me for soapboxing here, but unless somebody can show me some data that shows that there's a health benefit to lifting heavy that doesn't exist for lifting something for 8, 12, 15, 16, 20 repetitions, I can't change my tune, because the data out there that supports what I'm saying is rock solid.
So mention that statistic again. 70% of women, approximately 70% of women don't work out.
And so if you send out a survey, and as they do in sort of national health and fitness surveys, and people self-report what they're doing. So self-report is always a tough one, because people like to portray a much more positive health image of themselves than they probably do. So they tend to exercise a little more. And Haynes will tell you they eat a little less than they do, but we know they don't. So, 7 out of 10 women come back and say, or 8 out of 10 women say, I don't lift weights at all. Like, I'm not doing anything. And you could be forgiven for, thinking that it would be less when you look on social media, because you and I probably follow all the same people. And so the algorithm feeds us, and we're like, well, everybody's lifting. Like, I don't know, these people who aren't lifting. And I'm like, well, come to Hamilton, my city, which is sort of like the Pittsburgh of the North, but we still make steel here, and go down to Northeast End Hamilton and visit a few lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods, lots of high proportion of new immigrants. Nobody's lifting a weight down there. Nobody even goes to a gym down there. So, let's not sort of put the bubble up and believe that because we do it, everybody does it. Now, I think everybody should do it, but to lift heavy, you said you need a spotter. And a lot of people on social media say you need to get a personal trainer. And I'm like, so immediately you've ruled out people, who can't afford to go to the gym, who can't afford a personal trainer. And, frankly, a lot of people, that is the definition of gating behavior. So I think we need to step back a little bit and sort of say to somebody, what is more important, to get people engaging in the behavior and getting the health benefits that are associated with that, or the fine tuning of behavior that ostensibly everybody's doing, but they're not. And that's a different question. So I subscribe to all kinds of feeds and Substacks to see what other people are talking about. And there are some that are really, and I mean really good, for the advanced trainee. And if you lift, how many times a week do you lift?
Me, Louisa?
Yeah.
I'm lifting 4 to 5 days a week, but I will say 4.
So you're a freak. You're the freak. Like, you are not the norm, right? You are one of the, you're squeezing down into the tail end of what the rest of the population is doing. I'm lifting, most times down my home gym right here, or in my gym at work, like maybe 3 days a week. But for a man my age, that puts me in like a pretty narrow band of individuals, right? And that's fine if you want to talk to those individuals, but let's sort of, demystify this for women who are just like, what is this weight lift? Like, I don't lift weights. I don't want to get big. Who wants to get strong? I'm like, do you want to age well? Because I think it's a de rigueur activity for that.
So I gave a talk 2 nights ago. There was a few hundred women there, and it was all based on Alzheimer's disease, right? And people are like, oh, that's just a brain disease you get when you're older. I'm like, well, no. And like predominantly I was focusing on lifting heavy. It's one of, we've got sarcopenia, we've got osteoporosis, all of these are linked. And a lot of the women asked me, and it was up, do you have anyone that you could refer to us online that could just teach us how to squat? Because I was trying to say, try and get the biggest bang for your buck. We don't need you to go there and do the accessory muscles. You've got women, overweight women at the gym, doing these flies. And I'm like, by the way, I was doing flies this morning, right? But
it's all good.
It's all good.
No.
I'm trying to look good for someone.
Because you live 4 days a week. You can do flies.
But I'm doing the
that's
squats.
The
yeah. I'm like, can you squat, right? So a majority of the women put their hands up and said, I've never had a squat training. And I think that's important to note because you can do your knees. I got to say, right, I'm mid 30s. Stuart, I did something to my knees in January. Like I succumbed to an Instagram profile of this girl who was doing plyometrics. I'm like, oh my God, she looks amazing. I'm like, I can do plyometrics. By the way, the last time I did plyometrics, Stu, that's when I was a gun triathlete at 21, right? So like I'm talking 15 years ago. So I got weights, right? I did plyometrics, did my knees for 2 months out cold, January, February, done. So I'm like, you know what? So I told them, I said, you don't want to stuff your knees up, especially if you are in your 50s, like learn how to squat. So and then we've got the structuring, like you're saying, like building muscle, it's hard for me to do. I must be doing something wrong then in my 4 times that I'm spending resistance training. I am.
Let's be clear. Let's put this is a really important point on which a lot of this crystallizes. And if you're engaging in the activity and people say, "Oh, I'm not gaining muscle," I'm like, "You're not doing it wrong," because I'm gonna, I need to. This is really important. It's really great that you brought this up. And just for the record, I remember my 30s like it was over 25 years ago, okay? Just to put it in perspective. So slightly different generational, but yeah, like my mantra now for training, people say, Stu, what are you training for? I'm like, I'm training for life. This is the trajectory. That's the slope I'm on. And so I'm training so the slope is this and not this, right? So let's be clear. My mantra is no pain, no pain. And I can train the next day because I want to do something every day that makes me feel ridiculously good and that I know is good for me. Not every day is a gold medal day. I'm a mere mortal. I'm not I don't compete in master sports. And I think that describes the vast majority of people that are out there, and probably the vast majority of women that came to your seminar thinking that you were going to tell them something about, buffering their brain against a decline, when actually you said, well, physical activity, a decent diet, good sleep might be the 3 best lifestyle behaviors you could do to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's. And they were like, oh, geez, And my point is, and you probably made the same one, the reason to buffer yourself against it is because we have zero point 0.0 good drugs to treat it. So, all of this begins to make a lot of sense. But the muscle mass thing has been sort of held up, and there's a lot of narratives.
There's a lot of it happening right now, Stu. I'm getting scared by it.
No, I know, and people say it's the tissue, it's the organ of longevity, and it is to a certain extent. Like the more muscle you have, you're buffered against stress. So, you go in the ICU, the people with more muscle tend to survive because they have a reserve. It's like a reservoir of resilience or something like that. But the most important characteristics that your muscle can have are that it's strong. So strength per body weight, and you're powerful. So in your later years, the ability to sort of move fast, and it doesn't, everybody goes, why would you teach an older person to do, power? And I'm like, nobody's doing an Olympic lift if you're not trained to do that. I mean, if you want to do it, go for it, but get some advice, train to do it and do it right. But the ability to move quickly in old age, and that's what rising out of a chair, everybody goes, that's strength. I'm like, nope, that's power. That's the ability to generate force rapidly. And, the 5 times chair stand test, so arms across your chest, no arms on the chair, up and down 5 times. People who can, so that's a squat, right? It's a box squat because you're sitting down. I can't really demo it right here, but you get the point. How functional is that lift? Well, I'm like, if you can't do that, you can't get off a toilet. You're probably looking at full-time institutionalized care within 3 to 5 years. And everybody goes, oh, geez. And I'm like, so I don't need you to lift, put 2 plates on a side and do it 4 times. If you can and you like to do it, I'm not going to stop you doing it. But the weight that you have to lift is this right here. It's your upper body. And, so people say, well, so how should I train for that? I'm like, how about this? You know,
Yeah.
like,
There's a test as well where you sit down on the floor, cross-legged, and you
yes,
stand up without
yes,
using any arms, and it's like, can you do this?
yes.
Yeah.
So that's a really good friend of mine. He's Brazilian named Gil, and his group in Brazil came up with that task, and it's ridiculously good at predicting, poor outcomes as you age. And people say, well, why? And I'm like, because it's this talking to all of these muscles, talking to your sense of balance. And, once something in that whole pathway goes wrong, it's an indication that, something's not quite right. And so this is why these exercise tasks are so astonishingly predictive of future issues. Like, you couldn't do the X number of push-ups, and people go, oh, that's artificial. Like, you have to learn. And I'm like, absolutely. Practice doing push-ups, you get better doing push-ups, no question. But the point in the end is it's just about being, big prime movers like a chest press or a pull or a leg exercise. And so, yeah, flies are fine, but push-pull legs, pretty good combo.
Yeah, I think we're also missing the whole estrogen standpoint here, right? So we can talk about that because that's another thing that we touched on. It's so funny. I told the story. I do grand rounds at the hospital that I'm associated with, and just by chance, the one of the OBs, he's a surgeon, and he's like, "I want you to give grand rounds to OB." I said, "Oh, don't know about that," and I said, "Okay, could be fun because I'm going to be talking about. I mean, neurosurgery. I'm like, I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's disease. That's what I do." Oh my God. Okay. I had the chair of OB putting his hand. It was like we had to calm everyone down, right? So I learned a lot in that lesson because I brought up HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and Alzheimer's disease. We know that there is a link there between women who opt in for estrogen and progesterone and better brain health outcomes. So let's just say that's got to play a role here in building muscle as well. Whether you're on HRT or whether you're not, that phase of menopause for women is tricky, and building muscle in that phase is very hard as well.
So my take, and again, and I just, full confession, we have a big trial going in perimenopausal women right now. So stay tuned. Bring me back in probably about 2 years, and that's about how long it's going to run. I might be able to give you a good answer to this question. So, but I'll give you my outside the fishbowl looking in. So perimenopause is I heard it described by a woman on a podcast the other day, and it's fair to say it's a zone of chaos. Women's sleep gets disrupted, their ability to eat, etc. Brain fog, and I think it's a fair comment to say that if men went through this between the ages of 45 to 55. So that's not when 95% of women lose their menstrual cycle. They went through that same physiology. There would be an international global commission to figure it out because men, I don't think they could handle it for the most part. And I'm sure bunch of male listeners are like, who the hell is this guy? But I honestly believe that because again, I'm married. My wife's a cardiovascular physiologist. She's going through menopause, and the truth is, just watching her, I'm like, you're like, Jesus, like what can I do? And then the next second, it's like, okay, offer no advice. Clearly, that was the wrong strategy. But when you look at hormone replacement therapy, HT, as a rescuer of muscle, it doesn't work. The data, systematic reviews, and meta analyses show that there's no rescuing of muscle loss during that period. My take is that actually it's just aging combined with a lack of sleep, poor choices in diet, which it's not they say it's your fault. It's like this is the whole hormonal milieu that gets disturbed. And then that a lot of women aren't doing the exercises they should do, i.e., resistance training, to actually hang on to muscle. So I don't think that there's any magic associated with estrogen per se. But I will say this, and when I posted on Instagram recently about this, several women have said, you may be right, and Yet when I got on hormone therapy, I felt better, and then I could train. And I'm like, that is something I could get behind. And so, I don't want to dismiss that, correction of the symptoms of perimenopause by HT allow you to live a more normal, quote unquote, life, and so you can do the things that you want to do. And but to be clear, that's a secondary consequence of symptom relief as opposed to a direct effect of the hormone itself on muscle. But importantly, once again, it's about strength and power as the outcome and not building muscle. Now, we've got data. Women postmenopausally can build muscle. It's not impossible. You just may be, Louisa, unfortunately, you didn't pick your mom and dad wisely, and your genetics, that's a joke, by the way.
I get it.
Your genetics are just such that, you're clearly strong, you're clearly athletic, but you don't have the capacity. And I've lifted weights forever, and I'm bigger, but I'm nowhere near as big as I know some friends of mine who lifted just as long, and they're much bigger than I am. And that's just who they are. There were other guys who we lifted together, and they were like, dude, like I just can't, so eating a lot, the seafood diet, you see it, you eat it, was the only way that they gained weight. And even then, it was sort of like grudgingly. But other guys that go in, women, it happens the same. You pick up weights, and all of a sudden, it's like everything just, expands. And that the same as it is with, good sprinters, good long distance runners, good, I mean, yeah, I don't know. People get really upset about that is that actually you can control what happens with your muscle mass just simply by tweaking the external variables. And you can to a certain degree. But the analogy I use, and I think it works well, is you dip the cloth in the water, and the water coming out is the muscle mass gained or the benefit. And the first three turns are just going to the gym regularly. And a lot of water
Compound
came out.
interest.
Yeah, and now it's sort of like more protein, and you're twisting the cloth, and now it's creatine, and a little bit of water's coming out, but most of it came when you went to the gym regularly, and the rest is sort of like, somebody's cloths just don't have as much water. You're not going to get as much muscle mass, but strength, the function of your muscle, I still think way more important than the mass of your muscle.
Oh yeah. And like my distaste right now on social media, I'm really having a hard time accepting what's happening. So what I'm seeing happening is we've got young women now. I'm talking like 32-year-old influencers, hate that word. But let's just say and with no credentials behind them, and they're touting longevity, right? I'm like, what are you doing at that age? Like what's the matter with you that you're like, my God, like let's start doing this in our 40s, right? But okay, great.
Yeah.
But to the point where you're losing social connection because you want to be in bed by 9 p.m. You're completely like, you're not one drop of alcohol inside. I'm not saying that you need alcohol, but let's just keep on it. You're only eating like organically sourced, like they're like, I'm talking like they're preying on the food, like the food is coming from the gods, and like it's like, and then they're doing hyperbaric oxygen therapy, then they're doing red light therapy, then they're doing IVs, and I'm like, you don't look like you've even lifted your body weight in a squat. Like, get a life. Like, I actually scream at my phone. You should say I'm on my phone, like, get a life. And then it's just like, okay. And then I get off Instagram. But it's like, what you're missing. And the thing is, each to their own. But the thing that they're missing is you're now putting this out there to the world. And there are vulnerable people who are getting anxious, thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die because I'm not doing hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And I get asked every day, Louisa, should I be doing this? Like, they've only got a finite amount of money to spend, right? Should I be doing this? I'm like, no. Actually, HBOT actually is, out of every tool, has the lowest amount of efficacy when it comes to the scientific research and validation, unless you've just had a surgery or you've just had a stroke.
I think we can agree on this, and you tell me whether I'm off base. So I have a little talk that I give. I don't deliver, it's not an academic lecture, it's a lecture I give to the public sometimes when I speak. And I say that in broad strokes, there are four things that you probably need, and you don't have to have all four in order to live well. You might not live to be 120, but personally, I don't have a lot of interest in living to 120 and feeling like I'm 120. So I'll take the 90, 95, fall asleep and don't wake up. How we'd all like to go, right? Um, so the first is you have to be physically active. You have to be, particularly in later life, I think you have to be stronger. And it doesn't mean you need to be like gold medal strong, top 1%. You really, and this is broad strokes, don't want to be in the bottom or the third quartile. You need to be in the top if you can, or number two. And you can move yourself from 3 to 2 simply by a little bit of physical activity. And you can move yourself from 4 to 3 by doing something. Because the people in 4, they're not doing any physical activity. Diet, we could bash away for hours and what's important there, but I'll just call it sensible eating. Doesn't need to be too rigid. People say, why do I exercise? I'm like, because I like to eat cake every now and again and enjoy myself. And the next part, and I think that the pandemic shone a great light on this, is to have a good group of friends, to feel socially connected, and be able to have somebody that you can tell your problems to, if that's your partner, your spouse, or whoever it is, brother, sister, priest, anybody. And we see that time and time again in these long-lived communities that are, have a deep sense of their spirituality. That's their connection to their God, if that's the case, or to their fellow man, woman, somebody that they, social connection. And the pandemic, I think, particularly for older people, showed us just how vulnerable they could be. The last, and this is the why I leave it for last because I'm like crappy at it, is sleep. And if you can master sleep, my wife is great at a lot of things, but she is an Olympic champion sleeper.
Oh gosh.
I know. It's so bad. Yeah, we both have these Aura rings, and in the morning she's like, "Look at my sleep score." I'm like, "Come on."
Although I have a bone to pick with that. I don't think,
Go on.
I know that
Yeah.
it's great for total sleep time. I know it's great
Yes.
for looking at, trends and ratios. I don't
Sure.
think it's great at really predicting how much REM sleep you got.
No, I don't think so either. Like, let's be clear. It's a toy,
That's
right?
what I
So the
mean.
score is just, yeah. It's a little game we have in our marital relationship that she can clearly
It's a healthy game. I like
demonstrate
that.
how it's a good one. Yeah, superior to me she is in the ability to sleep, and so that's her superpower. And sort of once you get those four things in, then the rest of this hyperbaric, red light, low dose rapamycin, microdosing, whatever, SGLT2s or GLP1s or something like that. That stuff's deep in the margin.
I was about to bring up your study, but let's just spend a moment because you mentioned it. So GLP-1s are on the rise. We started off with Ozempic, which was the GLP-1, then we went on to tirzepatide, GIP and GLP. So that's having a double whammy effect. And then we're now moving on to a third one, which has
Triple.
Yeah. Don't even know what that is. I don't know if it's been released yet. What I'm seeing is an this was actually came up at the grand rounds with the OBs. They're like, but Louisa, what do we do with the patients who are now only having 20 grams of protein a day because they're not hungry, they're on GLP-1s?
Yeah.
And I'm like, force feed them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be tough. I think it's worth just getting it out there. I don't have anything against GLP-1s. I think that, if you struggle with weight loss, I'm okay with people losing weight on these drugs. Not a problem. I don't think it's a lack of willpower or anything like that. But there are some concerns. I've written an article that was written more for the public than it was for science about, is weight loss in these people and the loss of muscle, which I care about, is it a big deal? Or is it nothing to worry about? And it's probably somewhere in the middle for some populations. I think as people get older, it's a bigger deal. But the answer is we don't have data to say to somebody that it's not. I read a piece this morning from another Substack that I subscribe to, and this person did a pretty good job going through and saying, I don't think it's a big deal. I know this person takes GLP-1s, so inherent conflict of interest. But for some people, it's a revelation to lose the weight that they've struggled with, for their entire lives. And short of bariatric surgery, we don't have anything better. And this is only the beginning. So 5 years from now, it won't be injectables anymore. It'll just be orals. The orals will be lower dose. They'll last longer because the drugs will get better and better and better. This is what we saw with antihypertensives in the early to mid 70s. It was beta blockers, then it was calcium channel blockers, then it was ACE inhibitors, and now many people are on all three. And you get mechanisms that confluence and give you a good medication to target. And we'll get the same with these GLPs. So yeah, single GLP-1 agonist, a GLP-GIP, and then the tri. So it's not going away. So you can rail and rage all you want. You'll just see more of it. And in that sense, then yes, if you've got a low appetite, I think protein's important. But bring it back to first principles. If you want to hang on to muscle and you want to, I think, be functional on the other side of your weight loss, you need to lift some weights. You need to, it's great. After I wrote the piece that's out there, it's on a platform called The Conversation. I had several surgeons and people who prescribe these drugs, mostly bariatrics, and said, what do I tell people to do? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm a scientist. I was just pointing out the problem. But I'm like, here's like 1,000 free videos on YouTube that you could show your people and just say, you know what, start and get moving. And, that's a big deal.
Yeah, because then if you're not eating, then you're not going to even feel like going to the gym. You're not going to have the energy to go to the gym, even if you're eating carbohydrates, right? Like you need, I love carbohydrates. So unfortunately.
I love carbs too. Yeah. No, it's, part of isn't part of the joy of life and it's hanging out with your friends and going like, I hand on heart, like if you want to be a carnivore, you don't like carbs, you're a keto person. I'm like, what do you eat in an Italian restaurant? So
one of my greatest prizes, which you probably won't appreciate this, is going to my favorite steakhouse here in Manhattan. It's called Rocco's. And I love going there with my girlfriends and let's just, let's have fun. Let's have a glass of wine. I don't do that often, but I would hate for that to be taken away from me because then I think, what is life at the end of the day?
But that's part of the, it's a social circle, it's an event, and from time immemorial, people sat down and broke bread together and shared a meal, and that to me is one of the core parts of being human. And I think the social connection that you feel, I get it, not everybody feels it, but is so important to our mental health and well-being. And if that's out of order, and I think a lot of people will suffer. So it's the four pillars, and you can sort of tolerate one being a little wobbly, but when you've got two, it's kind of tough. If you've got three, I think it gets really hard. If you don't have any of them in order, then life begins to hurt, and you're probably not in great shape physically or mentally, I think.
All right. So, Stu, I really want to talk about the paper you sent me, and I'll say the title. It's an evidence-based narrative review of mechanisms of resistance exercise induced human skeletal muscle hypertrophy. That was a tongue twister. So I loved it. And I want to just briefly touch on a bit about, what you were trying, like the study design itself, the hypothesis, what you were trying to get out of this, and what were some of the results from it.
Yeah. So first, my name's on the paper, but there's a long list of authors. The first author is a guy named Dr. Cheng Yun Lim, who was outstanding postdoc in my group. He now is an assistant professor at the University of Newcastle in the UK. So he led the review. And what we tried to do in that paper was synthesize the evidence to look at what it is that actually results in muscle hypertrophy. So we made the paradigm pretty simple. And so inside the muscle, there are what we call intrinsic mechanisms. And then outside of the muscle, there are extrinsic, so things that we can control. So we can control that we lift weights, how we lift weights, sets, reps, etc. We can control our diet. We can control whether we take supplements, how long we sleep, hopefully how long we sleep. And then try to look at sort of the interaction of these two systems, if you like. In other words, manipulating the extrinsic to affect the intrinsic. And I think, we've already sort of established that the intrinsic, there's a certain part of it that you're going to have a hard time changing. The genes that you got from mom and dad are what you've got. How you sort of manipulate those genes. In other words, the way I've heard it expressed is, everybody's born with a piano, but unfortunately, some people just can't play it as well as others. So some people play, poor music like me, even though I took piano for a long time. And other people are concert pianists. So, and that's the elite of the elite. And then other people are just the mere mortals out there. And other people just, they can't play it at all, right? So you can change some of those things intrinsically, but your own biology, in our perspective anyway, dictates a large portion of what will happen from a hypertrophy perspective, rather than talking a lot about what it is that the levers we have out here to manipulate the outcome. Those are smaller players compared to the intrinsic systems, your biology that you have. Not to say that you can't get adaptations, but some people will always gain less muscle than others, and I don't think that will ever change. You might be able to squeeze yourself up the ladder a little bit, but if this is the peak and you're down here, you're not going to be that person. And I know that rubs a lot of people the wrong way, but we've known this, the drug industry has known it for, 50, 60 years. You put 100 people on an antihypertensive to lower blood pressure, 50 people get a great response. 30 people get a so-so response. 10 people are like nothing changes, and 10 people actually go in the opposite direction. The net result is that blood pressure goes down, but as a response variable, some people just don't respond, and some people actually respond adversely. And we don't really know why that's the case, but but drug companies says, oh well, here's the efficacy profile. Net is the lower, but the variability in the data is pretty substantial. It's the exact same thing in response to resistance training, changes in diet, supplements, etc. Everybody's got response variability. I think in the paper you probably would I always use the central diagram looking at trying to
Yes.
order in terms of magnitude those external levers. And definitely, people say, what's the key to muscle hypertrophy? And I'm like, well, go to the gym. And they're like, I do that. And I'm like, do you
They
do it
want a different
regularly?
answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you lift with good effort? And they're like, yeah. Or do you spend, this is the usual device. People spend hours scrolling on and far more time doing that than actually lifting a weight. And I'm like, do you do it 1 day a week, 2 days a week? Because maybe you need to do it 3, or maybe you're one of those sort of super responders that gets everything out of, you can do one workout and you take your shirt off and people are like, what are you doing? And it's just, it's how it is. And then diet is a smaller square than resistance training was, to our conversation earlier. Supplements, I'll freely admit, were not on the diagram going into their peer review process, but one reviewer insisted that we put them in. So we grudgingly said, okay. Sleep is in there. I think it's important. People with disrupted sleep, everything tends to go wrong. And I think that's part of that, perimenopausal zone of chaos that we talked about is sleep deprivation. You can't underestimate what that does to the rest of your physiology, because it really messes things up. And, probably a few other variables that could appear on that list, but that I think are a little bit sort of further down in terms of priority. And so, battling your own inherent biology itself it's a tough proposition. It doesn't mean that you're not doing it right or that you're not getting the benefit. You just may not get what you see either side of you. People look a whole lot better and that sort of thing. But it's I don't know where the quote comes from, but comparison is the thief of joy, right? Constantly comparing yourself to this person, but still you're like what's the enjoyment there if I'm never going to be that person? Nobody likes to do anything they're not good at.
This principle, it doesn't apply. When I talk about Alzheimer's disease, for example, and we look at certain risk factors, 20 years ago when we thought it was the amyloid cascade hypothesis, we used to think, oh, it's the ApoE4 gene. And we used to think, oh my God, if you get this, you're probably going to get the disease. But now we know that's just a risk factor. And if you do have the genes, if you do have the two alleles, then you might not get it, obviously, but you also might get it if you don't have the alleles, even if you're a 3-3. So this is a bit different, what you're talking about now.
Yeah, it's a bit different, and I think you could appreciate it. And people sort of say, so that's a single gene, hypothesis, and there's one allele that sort of controls, and it's either in some cases it's an on-off switch. If you don't have the right gene for dystrophin, you have a form of muscular dystrophy, and there's no way of getting around that.
Mutation on chromosome 4, you'll get Huntington's disease.
Right. So what we're talking about now is a complex polygenic trait regaining muscle. It's like saying type 2 diabetes, and there's not one single genetic locus that you switch on or off that gives you type 2 diabetes. The latest sort of collection of SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms that lead to type 2 diabetes or predispose you as a risk for type 2 diabetes, I think it might be 50 to 100 SNPs, and it explains about 15 to 20% of the variance. So the rest is lifestyle, and how does it go? Genetics loads the gun, and lifestyle fires it, type thing. And I mean all of those analogies, right? And so it's not a fait accompli that you're going to get X, Y, or Z disease, or that you're in trouble, because we know that that's not true. But you just have to accept that sometimes you're going to be great in terms of your, some people are just born long distance. Some people will run for hours, and they run fast for hours. And, why are we shocked that we can't do that? But if I say to somebody they can't gain muscle, they're just like, oh, you're just have tweaked. You don't have the right program. You're not eating the right supplements, or you're not eating enough protein or something. And I just don't think that that's true. You can squeeze a little more water out, but I don't think that you're gonna unlock something that wasn't there before, contrary to a lot of Instagram posts I see.
Does it ever upset you as a scientist when you do all of these studies, you put all your heart and soul and grant money into it just to come to the conclusion of what our ancestors told us, which was, hey, just get natural sunlight, eat from the garden, lift, heavy, walk. Does it ever? Because sometimes I think about that and I think, you know what? I got to get me a hex bar. I've got to get me a hex bar, get me a farm, and then get me sunlight, and I think I'll be good. Obviously, with a family around me.
Yeah. Does it upset me? No, it doesn't upset me. I'm a little further along in my career. Maybe it upsets my younger colleagues. I'm not sure. There are always questions to be answered, and I think that they're important questions. And we've done a singularly crummy job studying women. I'll just put my hand on my heart and say that for sure. So we're trying to rectify that with, every single study that we have going on right now, aside from one we have going on in older people, is in women. And so we're trying to look at what effects female physiology has and some of the outcomes that we thought, well, we know how that works, but we know how it works in men. What we are finding is that men and women are much more similar than they are different. Pathology-wise, you would know that sometimes that's not true. But in terms of the adaptability and the physiology that we're looking at, muscles, blood vessels, etc., there are differences, but they are small. So I get it. Women are from Venus, men are from Mars, but we're all the same species. We all live on planet Earth, and more similar than we are different. But men don't have a menstrual cycle. Men don't go through, menopause, and even mammals. When you look
And
at
men don't
mammals,
give birth.
yes,
I had to
no,
point
that's
that out for the women.
you do.
Yeah.
So I don't want to mansplain to anybody about there are obvious differences, right? But from the adaptability standpoint, they're much closer than a lot of people would like for them to be, because it's a great narrative to say, without being pejorative, train like a woman. No, train like a human, and you'll get the same outcomes. Men and women gain, relatively speaking, the same amount of muscle, whether they're pre or post menopause, doesn't matter. Just with the same lifting program, relatively speaking, up and down in exactly the same pattern. So the tissue that I study, there's nothing special that women need to do. It's really no different than men.
I'm seeing women, great friends of mine who are in their 50s, okay? Late 40s, maybe early, who are very muscly. And I know for a fact that they are on different forms of anabolic steroids, maybe low. And so that's a different, so it's like, we can't look like you.
No. So time out. And I think this is an important point, right? So boys and girls, everybody, before they were like, I'll say 10, you lined everybody up and everybody could equally run as fast. And if you did the flexed arm hang or whatever, boys and girls were exactly the same, right? Even probably some girls who just, they hung on there for forever, and the guys were like, couldn't do it. So, the girls are stronger. And then puberty hits, and boys, I won't say turn into men, because I don't know when mentally that happens. I got 3 sons, so believe me, I'm experiencing it. They definitely get the rise in muscle mass. Their hearts get bigger, their lungs get, their stature grows, everything else like that. Once you're done growing, so women start out lower than men, but the relative change from what they were is spot on the same. And there was just Mark Fallow just did a excellent meta-analysis on this. Greg Nuckols and his crew covered it on Mass Research Review. It's fantastic. And 2 papers in older people as well. So postmenopausally, same story. But you're never going to, as a woman, climb from here up to the top levels of where men are. Now, if you're taking exogenous hormones, testosterone, then all bets are off, because men who climb into that and are on performance enhancing drugs, they gain muscle way better than the rest of us, no question. So, I think it's to be clear about your own intrinsic biology, because taking a drug is an external lever that you're pulling. And I get it. Yeah, there's an advantage to that for sure.
Well, Stu, I think you've just invited me in 2 years to actually come and interview you in person, because I think I don't think we can do a part. We can't do a part 3 online. Like, I think if I haven't evolved in the next 2 years, where I've actually got an entire crew around me and a private plane, just taking me everywhere to interview, then I'm doing something wrong. So the next time you and I meet, we're going to be talking about this specific study. I'll probably be further along as well.
We'd love to have you. I can't stress to you or anybody how proud I am of the facilities and everything that we have at our place. And anybody that wants to come up and do it in person, I'll give you I'll give you the full 10-cent tour. But that we do have some places. I have the honor and privilege of being the director of something called the Physical Activity Center of Excellence. And it's a facility that community members come from the outside. There are seniors, there are people undergoing cardiac rehab, cancer patients, people with MS, people with spinal cord injuries. And it's I can't tell you like the atmosphere in there when we have 150 student volunteers that staff this place, and it's insane. Like anyway.
Oh, I can't wait to see it. Yeah.
Sure. The vibe is so good, right? And I have a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Heiss, who's looking at brain health in there as well. And it's a fantastic place. And Yeah, I love showing people through because people go, oh, like, how do you get all these people to do this? I'm like, I don't know. It's like some magic mojo or something.
Oh, I love it.
It really, it lifts me up every time I go through the facility, and the people that volunteer their time and the small crew that work there really, yeah, they inspire me every day. The clients are just, can't say enough good about them. They're awesome.
I can
Yeah,
tell.
fantastic.
I can tell by
Yeah,
your enthusiasm. So I can't wait to come
yeah,
there and experience it. But thank you
yeah.
for being part of the Neuro Experience podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.